woman stands at the end of a wooden pier. Her white dress catches the last light of a September evening. Her arms are stretched out wide like she is trying to hold the whole sky in place. She is laughing. Her new husband is behind the camera, crouching a little to get the golden sky in the frame behind her. The water below is so still it looks like glass. She looks like a woman who has never been afraid of anything. Both of them were gone. No alarm was raised, no distress call, no sound heard by anyone in the nearby cottages. The door to their room was closed but not locked. Their bags sat neatly by the closet. Her jewelry was on the nightstand. His wallet was on the bathroom counter, cash still inside. They had simply stopped being there, in the way things stop existing when someone has decided they should. When you line up the facts side by side, you stop feeling like you are looking at an accident. You start feeling like you are looking at a decision that someone else made. This is the story of Callie and Marcus Holt. It begins, the way so many of these stories begin, with love, and it ends the way too many of them end, with what people do when love gets in the way of money. Callie Renner grew up in a small town of 11,000 people, the kind of place where everyone knows what your father does. Her dad drove long-haul trucks. Her mom worked a pharmacy counter for 22 years. They were proud people. They didn't have much, but they kept what they had in good order. Callie earned a partial scholarship to a state university, studied communications, and moved to the city at 23. She was 28 years old when she met a man who would change everything. Marcus Holt came from a different world. His grandfather had started a freight company in the 1960s. His father expanded it, bought out competitors. By the time Marcus was born, the family name was on the side of trucks in 4 states. He had gone to the right schools. He had the easy confidence of someone who had never truly worried about money. He was not arrogant. That is important to say clearly. He was, by all accounts, a genuinely good man. Callie was there covering the event for a lifestyle magazine. Marcus was there because a college friend had dragged him along. They ended up standing in front of the same canvas, a large gray painting with a single red diagonal line across it. She asked him professionally what he thought of it. He said it looked like someone had started to cross something out. She laughed. He asked if she wanted to get a drink somewhere that wasn't also trying to sell her art. She said yes. 14 months later, they were engaged. His mother, Eleanor Holt, was a woman of great precision. She had managed the social world of the Holt family for 31 years. She made no dramatic objections to Callie. She was warm, in the way a room is warm, technically comfortable, but not quite welcoming. She asked Callie over dinner where she had gone to school. When Callie told her, Eleanor nodded and said, "Good for you," in a tone that contained an entire paragraph. Marcus held a real, significant ownership stake in Holt Freight Group. His father, Gerald, had placed it there. This was not a gift. It was not a symbol. It meant that Marcus's death or his marriage triggered specific legal clauses. A spouse had rights. A spouse could, under certain conditions, influence how a company worth decades of work was run. Gerald Holt had mentioned this to his wife before the engagement was even announced. What Eleanor Holt did with that information, and when she did it, is the central question of everything that followed. Marcus and Callie married on a Saturday in late August at a vineyard outside the city. 300 guests. Callie's father wore a suit he had bought the week before and kept pulling at the collar. Her mother cried before the ceremony. Marcus's side of the room was full of people who knew how to behave at events, which is its own kind of warmth. The speeches were kind. The dancing was good. The photographs came out beautifully. Creston Ridge was a private lakeside resort with 12 cottages along the water. Each had a private porch and a view of the lake. The property sat between 2 ridgelines of pine and fir. The nearest town was 40 minutes away. No cell signal in the cottages. You had to walk to the main lodge to get reception. No security cameras except at the front gate. A small staff left every evening by 8. It had been recommended by a colleague of Gerald's. A place Marcus had never been. A place Callie had not heard of before Marcus mentioned it. Remote, beautiful, isolated, suggested by a man whose name would not appear in the investigation for 4 years. They arrived on a Wednesday afternoon. Callie texted from the lodge before the signal cut out. "It's beautiful here, like being inside a painting. I'll call when we're back in range. Love you." Her mother read it and smiled and put her phone in her pocket and went back to the puzzle. She did not know, sitting there in that ordinary moment, that her daughter was already gone from her. The staff returned the next morning at 7. The housekeeper, Dorothy Fales, noticed the "Do Not Disturb" sign was gone. She knocked at 9 to ask about breakfast. No answer. She knocked again at 9:45. Still nothing. She was not yet alarmed. People sleep late on honeymoons. She knocked one final time at 11. Something about the quality of the silence made her use her key. Orderly, inhabited, empty. She stood in the center of that room for a moment, and then she went to find the manager. The local sheriff's department arrived that afternoon. Not the morning, the afternoon. There was an assumption that the couple had gone for a walk or taken a kayak out or driven somewhere. That assumption, reasonable on its own, would later look like time spent in exactly the wrong direction. The hiking trails near the cottages were checked. No trace, no sign, no disturbance on any surface. Marcus's parents were told at 6 in the evening. Eleanor Holt arrived the following morning. She drove herself. She came with a man she introduced as a family associate, Robert Vance. He sat in the lodge and said very little. He was not introduced as a lawyer or by any professional title. He was simply there, listening, in the way that certain people are paid to listen. Ray Renner stood on the dock looking at the water for a long time without speaking. Sandra went into Cottage 4 and stood next to the nightstand where the jewelry had been left. She looked at the small gold earrings, her own mother's, worn by Callie for luck on the most important day of her life. She did not touch them. She would tell investigators later that the room felt like a place where the explanation had already been decided. The angle was poor. The plate was partially hidden. The make matched several common vehicles. It had not been a guest's car. The investigators noted it. They could not trace it. Not then. There were no witnesses to any sound or movement. Between 10 at night and 7 in the morning, the couple 2 cottages down had taken sleeping medicine. The only other guest that night, Dennis Pruitt, staying alone in Cottage 9, said he had slept through the night. He could not be reached for further questioning afterward. He had paid cash. The contact information led to a disconnected number. Dennis Pruitt would not surface again in this investigation for 5 years. The first was accidental. They had gone to the water at night, something happened, the lake took them. The lake was searched 3 times over 2 weeks. Divers went into the cold, dark center twice. They found an old anchor chain, a bicycle wheel, the frame of a lawn chair. Nothing that answered the question. The second theory was that they had chosen to leave on their own, for reasons unknown. This theory required explaining why they left their money, their belongings, their phones, and all identification behind. It required explaining why Callie would not call her mother, someone she spoke to every 2 or 3 days without fail. No satisfying answer was ever produced. The lead detective, Frank Osei, was moved to a different department. He asked to stay on the case. His request was denied for reasons he was never able to get clearly explained. The file went to a younger investigator with 17 other open cases who called Sandra Renner once a month. Each time had nothing new to tell her. He was not negligent. He was simply overwhelmed. In the way that good people in underfunded systems become overwhelmed, slowly, without drama, until the case in front of them needs the energy they no longer have. The case becomes expensive to pursue and cheap to pause. Resources move to cases with newer evidence. The file grows thick with paper, which makes it feel finished, even when nothing has been resolved. The people who had the most to gain from the couple's disappearance cooperate fully. They express distress. They attend the right meetings. They do not obstruct in any way that can be named. They simply make themselves an unhelpful kind of helpful. And that particular kind of helpfulness is almost impossible to prosecute. A shareholder transfer had been completed that moved Marcus's ownership stake to a holding company, controlled by Gerald and Eleanor jointly. This was not illegal in a simple, provable way. The transfer was structured as a temporary administrative measure, pending resolution of Marcus's status. It was handled by lawyers who knew how to file things in ways that are technically open to anyone and practically accessible to no one. The documents existed. If you knew exactly what to look for, Where to look and how to read the specific language of corporate filings in that state? You could find them. The assumption was that no one would know all three things at the same time. That assumption held for longer than it should have. They hired a private investigator in the second year. Ray cashed in a retirement account he had been building for 12 years. Sandra sold her car and bought a cheaper one. They did not discuss the cost between themselves because the cost was not the question. The question was whether they could live with having the money and not using it. The investigator's name was Carl Deitch. He had done 20 years as a state police detective before opening his own firm. He was careful and unimpressed by people with money. That made him exactly the right person for this case. He found a financial payment to Creston Ridge made 30 days before Marcus and Callie's booking. It came through a third-party company called Meridian Venue Partners. The amount was far larger than any event at a 12-cottage resort would require. There was no event on the books. The stated purpose was full property exclusivity, but the resort had not been exclusively booked. Other guests had been there. Dennis Pruitt had been there. Deitch also found that Dennis Pruitt, the man who had checked out the morning of the disappearance and left a false phone number, had a documented history in private security. He had worked for a firm that specialized in its own words, discrete asset protection and resolution services. That firm had provided contracted work for Holt Freight Group on 3 separate occasions. It matched the exact window in which the dark SUV had appeared and disappeared on the entrance camera. A gap of that kind at that hour in that location was consistent with a portable signal suppression device, the kind that creates a bubble of interference, blocking any calls made or received within a few hundred feet. Not the kind you can buy at a store, the kind used by law enforcement, and less officially by people who work in the field that Dennis Pruitt's firm called discrete resolution. He scheduled a formal meeting. He came with printed documents organized and clear. The meeting lasted 40 minutes. The detective who received his findings listened carefully, took notes, said he would follow up, and thanked Deitch for his thoroughness. Deitch left cautiously, believing something might happen. He called back 2 weeks later. He was told the findings were being reviewed. He called again 3 weeks after that. He was told the same thing in different words. He sent a written summary directly to the sheriff's office. It was acknowledged by email. The acknowledgement said the information had been received. That was the last real communication he ever got. He had other clients. He had a business to run. The file went onto a shelf in the storage unit behind his office. He thought about it from time to time. He did not forget it, but the months passed the way they pass in a case that has found its ceiling and cannot break through it. 2 years became 3. 3 became 4. Somewhere in that time, the Holt family's lawyers quietly completed the legal process of having Marcus declared absent for estate purposes. The business moved forward. The lake at Creston Ridge stayed cold and still and gave up nothing. Joel Strath was making a series about disappearances in the Mountain West. Callie and Marcus were one of several cases he was looking into. He stayed 2 nights. He walked the property. He found Dorothy Fales, the housekeeper who had discovered the empty cottage, now living 40 miles away and working at a bed and breakfast. She made him coffee and told him what she remembered. And then she told him something she had never told anyone, because no one had ever asked her the right question. That morning, when Dorothy had gone to check the kayaks before she knocked on the cottage door, something she did every day as part of her routine, one of them had been returned to the wrong post. It was not missing, just moved. No guest had signed one out. No one had mentioned using one. The bow was wet in the early morning hours when no one should have been on the water. Joel Strath drove back to the city and spent 6 weeks trying to understand what that meant. It meant that whatever happened in the cottage or on the access road that night, something had also happened on or near the water. Thomas Garrity was a retired federal investigator with 22 years in financial crimes. He read the story on a flight from Dallas to Seattle. By the time the plane landed, he had already written a message to a former colleague. Garrity did not read this as a missing persons case. He read it as a business transaction. When you look at a disappearance as a transaction, he would later explain, you stop asking where the people went and start asking who benefited from their absence and whether that benefit was planned in advance. Those are cleaner questions. Money, unlike people, leaves a record even when it is trying not to. The shareholder restructuring, completed in 21 days, Unusually fast for something that complex, almost as though the legal groundwork had been prepared in advance. The payment to the resort through Meridian Venue Partners. When Garrity traced Meridian, he found it was a shell company with one registered agent and no history except that single transaction. The shell had been created 4 months before the wedding. 4 months before Marcus and Callie had even decided where to go for their honeymoon. The creation date sat in his notes like a stone with sharp edges. Someone had built the mechanism for that payment before the couple had chosen the destination. The recommendation to Creston Ridge had come from Warren Tillis, a colleague of Gerald's. Tillis had suggested it to Gerald, who passed it to Marcus and Callie as a romantic find, a hidden gem, the kind of private place you'd only hear about through personal connections. Marcus loved the idea. Callie looked it up, saw the beautiful photographs, and they booked without hesitation. What they did not know was that Tillis had a board-level relationship with the company that owned Creston Ridge. He had the resort manager's direct number. He had the ability, which he had used, to arrange access and set things in motion without going through any normal booking process. Her name was Diana Reese. She had spent her career building financial conspiracy cases. She sat quietly with the documents for a long time. Then she said, "This is not a missing persons case. This is an organized removal. The missing persons part is just the outcome." She was right. And being right about it did not make it easier to prove. They worked for 8 months, quietly, without involving the local sheriff's department, whose handling of the investigation had raised concerns neither of them wanted to make public before they had something solid. Robert Vance, the man who had arrived at the resort with Eleanor Holt, the man introduced as a family associate, the man who sat in the lodge and listened and said very little. His full professional background, which the original investigation had never properly looked into, turned out to include 15 years as a private consultant to families and companies, dealing with what he called sensitive situations. His clients were not public. His work was not on any website. He was known in a very specific and carefully enclosed professional community as someone you called when a problem needed to stop existing, without anyone being able to explain exactly how it stopped. In both, someone had become financially inconvenient. In both, the inconvenience had been resolved in a way that was never investigated as resolution. One had been ruled a suicide. One was still an open missing persons case in another state. Garrity was not building a serial crimes case. He was building context. He was showing that Robert Vance was not a man who helped families through grief. He was a man who helped families create the conditions that made grief the only remaining story. He had been living in another state under a slightly adjusted version of his name. He had changed enough details of his life to be hard to find, but not enough to be impossible. He had underestimated perhaps the patience of a retired investigator with nothing left to prove, and a clear conscience about how he used his remaining time. In the first 2 sessions, Pruitt said nothing useful. In the third, facing financial records that placed him directly in the payment chain connected to the resort, and phone records that put his device in the area on the night of the disappearance, he stopped pretending and became something quieter. Marcus and Callie had not drowned by accident. They had not left on their own. They had been taken from the cottage in the early morning hours, moved through the back of the property to the access road, driven to a secondary location, and from there, handled in a way designed to ensure they would never be found. The lake had been part of what happened, but not the way anyone had theorized. The kayak had been used to check depth and current in a section of the water, away from where the official searches had ever looked. In cases built on financial motive and careful concealment, when the people responsible are both resourceful and thorough, the physical evidence of the most important fact is often the hardest to produce. The investigators established the plan. They established the people involved. They established the financial motive with a clarity that left little room for any other reading. What they could not produce was the physical evidence that prosecutors need to take a case to its fullest possible conclusion. Eleanor at his side. Medical records confirmed it. He died having never been formally questioned about any of this, which is its own kind of injustice. Robert Vance was charged: conspiracy, obstruction, financial fraud. He went to trial in federal court. The jury deliberated for 4 days and returned guilty verdicts on 2 of 3 counts. He served part of his sentence. He is out now. He does not speak publicly about any of this. The cooperation is what gave investigators the thread they needed. The reduced sentence is the price of that thread. Whether it was worth it is not a question with a clean answer. Eleanor Holt was questioned, formally, extensively across multiple sessions. The investigators believed she had known. Garrity believed she had done more than know. But the evidence that could establish the exact nature of her involvement and when she had it was, and this is the word investigators use when they mean something more painful, insufficient. She was not charged. Her lawyers were present at every session. She answered every question in the careful, measured way of someone whose every word had been prepared in advance. Frank Osei, the first detective, the one who had been reassigned, heard a podcast in his kitchen on a Tuesday morning, years after the case had been taken from him, and something in it pulled a note he had written in a small notebook back to the surface of his mind. He had noticed something in those early days when he interviewed Eleanor Holt at the resort. She had been composed. Genuinely composed. She had asked precise questions about the investigation's direction, about the evidence, about the working theories. She had not once asked about Callie, not her well-being, not her family, not whether there was anything she could do to help Callie's parents. Marcus was her son. Grief for him was present and real seeming. But Callie had been her daughter-in-law for 14 days, and her name did not cross Eleanor's lips a single time. It was something more honest than that, a record of how truth moves through time, how it gets buried and partially recovered and buried again, how the people who bury it are often the ones standing closest to the grief it would explain. Sandra Renner watched it alone at the kitchen table on a laptop, with a cup of tea she didn't drink. When it was over, she sat very still. She was not crying. She was past the particular kind of crying this case had required of her. She was in something quieter and more permanent. Certain kinds of sadness settle into a body over years and quietly do their work. Sandra kept Callie's earrings in a ceramic dish on her nightstand. Small gold studs, her own mother's, worn by Callie for luck on the most important day of her life. She had kept them there since the police returned them after the evidence process closed. Every morning she saw them when she woke. Every night she saw them before she slept. She had never decided to do this. It had simply become the arrangement, and changing it would have required a decision she had not been able to make. Arms stretched wide, laughing at something, the sky going gold behind her. People still find it when they search her name. They still leave comments, mostly people who watched the documentary or read the articles. They say things like "rest in peace" and "you deserved better" and "we haven't forgotten." The comments are genuine. They are also not enough, in the way that all such words are not enough when placed next to the actual size of what they are trying to address. Ray drove up alone one last time before the demolition. Sandra had not come. She said she didn't need to see the place, that the place was not where Callie was. He stood on the dock for a long time. The lake was very quiet. The water was dark near the center, and he didn't look at that part. He looked at the near shore where the light was better, where you could see the stones through the clear shallows. He stood there until it felt like enough. Then he drove back home. She said she didn't need to see where Callie had been last. She needed to remember where Callie had been the most, which was here, in this house, in this kitchen, sitting at this table, eating cereal too fast before school, making fun of the puzzle pieces her mother always had spread across one corner. That's the place that doesn't get demolished. That's the one that stays. The financial records, the shareholder transfers, the cell tower data, the payment trail, the record of Vance's conviction and Pruitt's plea. The interview transcripts laid out in the flat, factual language of federal inquiry. It is all there, available, readable, indexed, and still the bodies have not been found. And still Eleanor Holt tends her garden. And still the photograph of Callie on the pier is online. Timestamp unchanged, her arms wide open. The sky going gold behind her. It can establish responsibility. It can assign consequence, partial and imperfect as that consequence may be. It cannot return what was taken. It cannot answer the questions Sandra asks in the quiet of a house still organized partly around an absence. It cannot give back the years her parents spent watching each other make phone calls that led nowhere. What the legal system can do sometimes with enough time and enough people who refuse to stop pulling threads is make silence finally expensive enough to break. That is not justice shaped to the size of the wound, but it is something. She stretched her arms wide and thought most likely about nothing except the beauty of the sky and the fact that she was exactly where she wanted to be. She was 29 years old. Marcus Holt was 32. They are not forgotten. That is the smallest and most permanent truth in any of this. The most lasting thing the people who arranged their disappearance failed to arrange was the erasure of the fact that they had existed, that they had been loved, that there were people who would not stop and did not stop in asking what happened to them. It ended here, and somewhere out in the photograph still time-stamped 7:42 on a September evening, in the gold earrings in the ceramic dish on Sandra Renner's nightstand, in the memory of a man who drove to a dock alone one last time and looked at cold water in the sun, somewhere in all of that, the truth has been keeping its own kind of time, patient, precise, waiting for exactly this.